Welcome back to CSS3 Essentials. Now that you have a basic understanding of how to use transitions, let's take a look at a slightly more complicated example. Here's what we're going to build today. So this would be a system where when you hover over the image, you want to show a caption, but we want to do it stylistically. So admittedly, I'm going a bit over the board here, but it's just to show what is possible. If I hover over the image, take a look. Now, a bunch of things are happening here. First, when I hover over the image, pay attention, the image zooms in about 10%. Next, a black overlay will show up and we're doing a 360-degree rotation. A little bit too much, you might want to just slide down, but for the purposes of our demo. Next, I want you to see that the heading and the text slides in from the right. But they don't come in at the same time, they're slightly delayed. If you watch, the heading will slide in just a little bit sooner than the paragraph will. Let's try it one more time. There we are. So it seems simple, but there's actually quite a bit going on here. And then we have some more traditional stuff like some slight shadows around the edge. All right, let's get started building this absolutely from scratch. So I'm going to open up Sublime Text and we have a blank page. And the first step is we want to bring in that image. And I've called it photo.jpg and we'll give it a name of car. Now, with HTML5, you can self-close this if you want, but you don't have to. It really just comes down to what you would prefer. Next, let's view this in the browser. Here we are, and let's work side by side for this demo. So the first step is, this image is a little bit larger than I prefer, so I'm going to set a width to it, maybe 400 pixels. The next step is I want to center this on the page. So rather than creating a container, let's just use the body as our wrapper because all we have for this demo is a single image and we can get away with that. So I'll set a width of 400 pixels and then I'm going to set margin to auto and that will center it on the page. But then I want to push it down a touch. So maybe 50 pixels margin top and bottom just to push it down a touch. The next step is we want to create a caption for this image, but we want to have a heading and some text. So let's just do it like this for the time being. I'll have a heading here, and then below it, I'll paste in some lorem text, and maybe we'll divide this into 2 paragraphs, something like this. Now, you'll see it's showing up directly below it. But there's one more problem here is this is kind of an old way to do it because there's no direct relationship between the headings, the paragraphs, and the image. You're just simply seeing an image and then some more text. So we need to create a link to it. And with HTML5, we can create these relationships by using the figure element. And now I can have my image and below it, I can specify a caption. And we do that via the fig caption element. So this may seem to you like more HTML tags, but now we are directly creating a relationship between the caption and the image itself. If I reload, the only thing you'll see change is by default, the figure will have some margins on it. So let's remove that right now. And now we have the exact same thing, but semantically, this is much better. And we also have some handles so we can move around our caption, and that's helpful too, rather than resorting to divs. So the next step is I want the caption to be all the way up here with the image. And that's an important thing to remember is we're not going to do our animations at the very beginning. We want to make it work normally for all browsers, then we're going to enhance it for newer browsers. So first, we go and grab that fig caption. And remember, the fig caption contains just the text below it. So if I hide it, you can see it's affecting all of that. The first thing I want to do is set a position of absolute, and then I'm going to set top to 0 to push it all the way up. But now you're going to see that's pushing it all the way up beyond even the image. So let's set a new positioning context for the figure. That way it won't go above the image. Next, I'm going to apply a box shadow around this entire image as well as some borders. So we'll use the figure and let's set border, maybe 5 pixels, solid white. Now, because the background is white, you're not going to see anything. It's there, but you just can't see it because we've set a background of white. And we also have this issue where it seems like the image is a little bit larger than its container. So let's instead say, rather than the width and the body element being the exact same number, let's set the image to 100%. And now that way it will not exceed that value. So let's return the border back to white. And now, if we want to see it, why don't we apply a light box shadow around it. And we'll say 4 pixels worth of blur, and I'm going to set RGBA, and we're going to make it black, and then I'm going to set the alpha to around 30%. And that way we just get a very subtle effect, as you can see right there, but it looks good. Next, because figure is an HTML5 element, I'm going to make sure that I explicitly state that the display should be blocked, and that might fix some issues in older browsers. Next, I want to style the fig caption because this black text doesn't look good. We really need an overlay. So let's set a background color equal to black for now. And if we were to set the color to white, that's still too much. We really just want a light overlay. So I'm going to replace black once again with RGBA, and we'll set it to around 40%. There we go, that looks a lot better. But now a problem is the height is not correct. You can see it's cutting off there. If I return it back to 1, you can really see it. So we want to make sure that the height of the fig caption is as high as it can be. So I'm going to set that value to 100%. And while I'm here, just to be safe, I'm going to set the width to 100% as well. Good, so now let's return the background alpha to 40%, and that looks a lot better. Next, I would like to add some padding all around. So we have a couple ways we can do that. We could apply it to the fig caption itself. If I set 20 pixels, you'll see that that is increasing the width, and that's how it should be. The padding is added to the width itself. If you wanted to override that, you could do something like WebKit box sizing and set that to border box. If I reload, that's going to fix it. What box sizing does is it allows us to specify the box model. And this is going to render like it would in older versions of Internet Explorer. With the border box setting, the padding will be considered part of the height. So if I have a width of 500 pixels, and then we have padding of 20 pixels on the left and right, normally that would make the total width of the element 540. But if we set it to border box, the padding will be considered part of the width. So really, you can think of border box as saying, whatever you specify the width is, it will never go above that. A lot of people think this is a much smarter way to go about it. And then the padding will be subtracted from the width, so it kind of shrinks in. So that's a really good tip to have. Just make sure you use all of the vendor prefixes. If I run this through Prefixer, you can see we have WebKit, Moz, and the official version. But for now, I'm going to return that back to its default. The next step is I'm going to set a font family, and we'll just set that to sans serif. But now I want the heading to have a background strip H3 and set a background color of black. So what's happening here is it's being cut off because we applied padding to the parent element. So why don't we instead remove this and instead apply it to the H3 and the paragraph. That way I can make sure that the strip stretches. So let's do that. Fig caption H3, fig caption P. Now technically if you wanted to, you could bring this down to star, but this is bad for performance because the CSS engine will work right to left. So it's going to grab all elements and then filter that down to only the elements that are children of fig caption. So I think it's better to be a little more explicit. And then once again, I'm going to set padding to 20 pixels, reload. And now what's happening here is it's 20 pixels top, right, bottom, and left. Why don't we adjust this to maybe 10 pixels on the top and bottom and 20 on the right and left? And that's starting to look better. And we'll make some more tweaks shortly. The next step is we have these built-in margins. So why don't we bring those down to 0 as well? So that'll push it up just a tad. There we go, that looks better. And while I'm thinking about it, why don't we go and add one more paragraph and we'll have a link somewhere that says read more. And we'll want to make sure that we style that as well. We'll do that right here. Fig caption A, color, we'll set that to white. So the only other thing I see here is why don't we have a little margin above the H3? So if I were to set margin top to 20 pixels, just to have that pushed down so it actually looks like a strip. All right, so this looks good. So the next step is, now that we know it works, why don't we create a base on and off setting for when you hover over the figure. So right up here we'll say figure, when you hover over it, only then do we want to display the fig caption. Let's take this step by step. First, let's make the fig caption have a display of none. But when you hover over the figure, then get the fig caption and set the display to block. There we go. And now we have a simple on and off trigger. This will work in Internet Explorer, any browser. It's very simple. They're all set. But we also want to give a little feedback. So because there is an on and off switch, we're going to make sure that we set the cursor to pointer for the figure element. That just gives us a little more feedback. All right, so let's add a little bit more. What if rather than doing display none and display block, we set the opacity to 0 and then opacity to 1 when you hover over it? You're going to get the exact same effect, but watch what happens when we begin applying transitions. WebKit transition, and we're going to transition opacity over the course of 1 second. Now, when I hover over it, we're already getting a little bit more feedback. Remember, in the browsers that don't support this, they will simply go from 0 opacity to an opacity of 1. And we'll want to provide fallbacks for Internet Explorer, but Prefixer will do that for you just fine. If we run that through, to give you an example, you can see it will add the filter for Microsoft, the older version, and the official version. All right, so even that's looking good, but I want to have a little bit more flair. So what if we add a transformation? And you've learned about these a touch, and we're going to rotate this 360 degrees. And then when we hover over the figure, we're going to bring that transformation and we're going to rotate it back to 0. Let's see what that does. Now, if I reload, hover over it, you're not going to see anything because right now we're only transitioning the opacity. Let's make that all so it will listen for everything. Now, can you see we're getting a very intense rotation? All right, I don't want that to go the sides of the image. So why don't I return to figure and I'm going to set overflow to hidden. Now if I reload, it's contained within it. Pretty neat. Already we're doing some cool stuff. Now again, this is a little intense. I'm not sure you should do rotations for this, but just to show you what is possible, it's fun to play around with. Next, rather than setting a transition to 1 second long, why don't we make it 0.4 seconds? And then I'm also going to set an easing type of ease in, and that means it will slowly ease in. Now if I reload, much faster. Looks good. The next step is, when I hover over this, I would like to zoom in the image maybe 10%, just a touch. So we can do that right here, Fig Caption, IMG. So we have our defaults, and we really don't need to adjust it. What we want to do, though, is adjust the image when you hover over the figure, like so. And then we could say width 500 pixels. This is one way. Reload. And that does work, but that looks awful. If we use transformations instead of width, we don't affect the height or the layout like you can see is happening right now. So let's do that. WebKit transform, and we're going to scale it this time. So if I did scale 2, that'll make it twice as big. Way too much. Let's keep it more subtle and scale it by 10%. Hover over it, and now it just goes in a little bit. But that's still a little intense. So why don't we make that occur over the course of maybe a second or two? So we could apply the transition to the hover, but watch what happens when we do. WebKit transition all over the course of maybe a second and a half. So if I go over it, you can see that it will zoom in, but watch what happens when I mouse off. It immediately defaults back because we're only applying the transition to the hover state. It's always a best practice to apply it if you want two-way transitions to the base state. So I will apply it to the image. Then when you hover over it, we will scale it, and then we'll scale it back. Reload, and it zooms in a touch. When I come out, it zooms out. Good. The next step is I'm going to show you about how to use delays. So what if we hover over it and we first want to zoom in, and then we see the overlay? Well, we can do that. We know that it's going to zoom in over the course of a second and a half. So what if we set a transition delay of a second and a half as well? And I'm going to put these together, and I'll add the seconds there. Now watch what happens. If I hover over it, it zooms in, and then it shows up. And this is how you can create sequential animations or transitions, is by doing the delay. And what you want to do is make sure they add up. If you want to zoom in the image for a second and a half, then you can say, okay, go to the next animation or transition and say that needs to delay until this first one completes. Now, what I think is happening here is it's a little too long. You shouldn't have to wait 5 seconds to view it. So why don't we have this delay by a half a second before it begins, just so you get a little bit, yeah, that looks good. Next, I want the headings and the text to slide in from the right. Right now, it's just showing up there automatically. So why don't we do that right here? Left is going to be set to 100%. But remember, you can't work with those values unless you have a positioning context. So I will apply one now. And what that's going to do is it's going to push it to the right off the screen. So here we're just left with the overlay. But when we hover over the figure element, then we want to see the text slide in. So once again, figure, hover, then get the H3, and we'll do the same thing for the paragraphs. And then we'll set the left to 0. And once again, that's not going to look like any transition is happening. It's not. So let's apply one right up here. And for now, we're going to group them together, but then we'll switch them out shortly. And we'll set that over the course of a second for now. Hover over it, and it looks like it's not working, but that's just because we've set the time to be too short. If I come off, you can see that it is sliding. So let's just change this a bit, and we're going to make a delay. WebKit transition delay. Now, it should be noted you can group delay into transition, and we'll look at that shortly. Let's delay it first by around 1 second. So it's going to wait a full second and then run this transition. Hover over it. There you go. So once again, I know this is going very slow and we'll speed this up, but just so you can see how it works, we zoom in, the overlay displays, then the text slides in. But what I would like to do is slide the heading in, and then I want the paragraphs to come in just behind it so it looks like they're coming in one after the other. So to do that, we'll apply the transitions directly to the elements themselves. Right here, I'll say Fig Caption P, and then we'll do another one for Fig Caption H3. So the H3 tag will come in over the course of maybe 0.4 seconds, a little bit arbitrary, and we're going to have it delay maybe by a second. Then the paragraph, I want to have it come in just right behind it. So I could copy this and paste it in, but I don't want to duplicate myself too much. So instead, I'm going to remove it from both of them and keep that property alone right up here. Then for the paragraph, I'm going to have that delayed by maybe 1.2 seconds, just 20% later. Let's see how that looks. And now can you see that the heading comes in first and the paragraph is right behind it? Zoom in, heading comes in, then the text comes in. Scroll off, and you'll see everything is done in reverse. So what's cool about this is maybe you want to apply a class to the figure so you can specify it, but then if you have your article, something like this, and I'll paste in some lorem text here, then you have your figure, and I'll add a little bit more below. You can see you have a nice layout, and when you have images, you can apply a caption to them, and then immediately the styling will take effect. If you decide later that you're going to add a different image, you simply add your figure, give it a class if you want to target that, reload, and then it will be applied to that one as well. So that's going to do it for today. The last thing I want to show you is if you do decide that rotation is too much, I may agree with you. So just look for your rotation and you would remove that completely. And then when we hover over it, rather than rotating, it will just fade in. If you'd rather have something where maybe the overlay will drop down from the top, you can do that as well. Since we know that the Fig Caption is already at the top, why don't we set the top to -100%? And then once again, when you hover over the figure, we'll get the Fig Caption and set top to 0. Let's try that. Reload. And now you get that effect where it slides down. So yeah, if you play around with this stuff, you can have some good fun without having to worry about dealing with JavaScript. Now again, the important thing to remember is, will it work in older browsers? You always want to set it up where in older browsers, they still see something. And then for the modern browsers, you can give them a little bit more flair like we've done here. The last step here is you want to make sure that you compensate for all browsers. Right now, this is not going to work in Firefox because we've only used WebKits. So if we wanted to try that out, hover over it, we're just getting the fallback, and that's good. It's going to work just fine in that or Firefox 3.6. But Firefox 4 can handle these transitions. So I'm going to run this through prefixer.com really quickly, and you can see it does all of that for us. Reload the page, and now if we try it, now we're getting the effects in Firefox as well, because it is using these Moz transition prefix. Here's that one. And the one below. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this. That's going to do it for today.